Hey guys, tonight, let's slow things down a bit. Maybe dim the lights, put your phone face down, and let your brain clock out early. This is one of those history stories that doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It just sort of exists. Awkwardly, quietly, lingering in the background of royal portraits where everyone looks deeply uncomfortable for reasons no one bothered to explain at the time. Tonight, we're talking about women who were married to boys. Actual boys. Kings, princes, heirs, technically powerful on paper, but still very much children who probably needed help tying their shoes. And beside them were adult women, sometimes teenagers, sometimes fully grown, expected to play wife, mother, political operator, and emotional shock absorber, all at once. Because politics, because dynasties, because Europe never met a bad idea, it didn't immediately formalize with a wedding. So take a breath. This is not going to be loud or shocking. No dramatic music cues. No sudden betrayals. Just a long, steady walk through some deeply uncomfortable royal living arrangements. Told gently, with a bit of dry commentary, and the occasional reminder that history was often run by people making very strange choices, while wearing heavy clothes. Let's begin. Royal Europe had a habit of treating marriage less like a personal relationship and more like a diplomatic envelope. Inside the envelope you could find land claims, peace treaties, military alliances, and sometimes a note saying, "Sorry about the age difference, but this should stabilize the region." Love, naturally, was not included. Consent was more of a suggestion, and childhood was seen as an inconvenient phase to be rushed through as quickly as possible, especially if a crown was involved. In many cases, kings died young. Plagues, infections, horseback accidents, the usual medieval surprises. And when a king died, the crown didn't wait around for adulthood. If the heir was 5, then congratulations, Europe now had a 5-year-old monarch. And because a king was expected to have a queen, the solution was obvious to the adults running things. Find a bride, preferably one who could manage him, or manage around him. Which brings us to our first quietly tragic figure. Let's drift over to France for a moment. France is very good at this particular genre of historical discomfort. In 1380, King Charles V of France died, leaving behind an 11-year-old son. That son became Charles VI. At 11, Charles VI was officially King of France, which meant he was also officially not in control of anything. The real power rested with his uncles, who promptly began draining the treasury like it was a group project they did not care about. Now, Charles needed a wife, not because he wanted one, not because he understood what marriage was, but because a king without a queen was considered incomplete, like a chess set missing a bishop. Enter Isabeau of Bavaria. Isabeau was around 14 when she arrived in France. By medieval standards, that was already acceptable adulthood, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval standards. She married Charles VI in 1385. He was 17 by then, which almost sounds reasonable until you remember that he had been king since childhood and had never lived anything resembling a normal human life. At first, things seemed fine. Isabeau did what queens were supposed to do. She smiled, produced heirs, learned court etiquette, and tried to survive the social minefield of French politics. But then Charles VI began to unravel. In his 20s, Charles started experiencing severe mental illness. He had episodes where he did not recognize his wife, or his children, or himself. Sometimes he believed he was made of glass and would refuse to be touched. Other times he attacked his own knights. This was not a great environment for a marriage or a country. And here's where the age dynamic becomes important. Isabeau was still relatively young, but she was mentally present. She understood politics. She understood survival. And she was married to a king who could not reliably rule, remember, or function. So she did what many queens in her position did. She stepped into power. Immediately, history turned on her. Isabeau was accused of extravagance, adultery, corruption, and general moral decay. She became one of those queens history loves to blame when things fall apart. But when you look closely, you see a woman trapped in a marriage that began in adolescence, tied to a husband whose illness made him unpredictable and dangerous, surrounded by ambitious men, who resented her influence and tasked with holding together a kingdom that was slowly collapsing. This was not romance. This was damage control. Let's float gently onward. England, of course, has its own version of this story. England always does. In 1399, King Richard II was deposed, and the man who replaced him, Henry IV, inherited not just a shaky crown, but a kingdom deeply suspicious of legitimacy. So naturally, the next generation would be used to patch things up. Henry IV's son, Henry V, is often remembered as the heroic warrior king of Agincourt. Very inspiring, very Shakespearean. But before all that, Henry V was a pawn. He was married in 1420 to Catherine of Valois. Catherine was the daughter of the French king. She was about 18. Henry was 33, so this one doesn't quite fit our theme yet. But stay with me, because Catherine's real story starts after Henry dies. Henry V died young, probably dysentery, history's least glamorous assassin. Their son, Henry VI, became King of England at just 9 months old. A literal baby. And because Europe was deeply committed to the idea that this was normal, arrangements began early for his future marriage. Henry VI grew up shy, deeply pious, and profoundly unsuited to kingship. He did not like war. He did not like confrontation. He liked prayer, books, and quiet. Unfortunately, he ruled England during a period when England demanded the opposite. At 23, Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou. Margaret was about 15, not an adult woman yet, but notably older and far more forceful than her husband. And very quickly, the power imbalance flipped. Henry VI suffered from mental breakdowns similar to Charles VI of France. Periods of complete withdrawal, catatonia, silence, and during those stretches, Margaret became the effective ruler of England. She led armies. She negotiated alliances. She fought for her son's claim to the throne. And she was absolutely hated for it. Because once again, we have a familiar pattern. A woman married young into a fragile kingship, stepping into authority out of necessity, then being blamed for the chaos she was trying to survive. And Henry? Henry drifted. He prayed. He dissociated. He was present in name only, a boy king who grew into a man without ever growing into power. Let's slide eastward now, towards Spain, where dynastic weirdness was practically a competitive sport. One of the most uncomfortable royal marriages involved Juana of Castile, later known to history as Juana la Loca. Juana married Philip of Burgundy. This marriage was politically brilliant and personally catastrophic. Juana was deeply emotional, possibly mentally ill, and trapped in a marriage where affection was conditional and power was always slipping out of her hands. But what matters for our theme is what happened around her. Juana's children were married off early, very early. Her son Charles, later Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, was betrothed as a child. His sisters were married into foreign courts before they were emotionally prepared for anything resembling adulthood. These marriages paired adolescent girls with young boys, or vice versa, not because anyone thought it was healthy, but because timing mattered more than humanity. Which brings us to one of the most quietly tragic figures of all, Margaret of Austria. Margaret was engaged at age 3.3. She was sent to France to be raised as the future queen. She grew up there, learned the language, wore the clothes, memorized the role, and then, at 11, her fiancé, the future Charles VIII of France, decided to marry someone else for political reasons. So Margaret was sent home politely casually. Like a returned gift, she would later be married again, and widowed again, and again. Each marriage arranged, each one political, each one leaving her more isolated and more cautious. Margaret never ruled outright as a queen consort, but she became one of the most competent political operators in Europe. Because when you raise someone inside a system that treats them as a movable asset from infancy, they either break or adapt. She adapted. Let's pause here for a moment. Not dramatically, just a gentle pause. What all of these stories share is not shock value. It's normalization. Europe didn't see these marriages as strange. They were practical, efficient, necessary, a way to keep borders quiet and bloodlines intact. The emotional cost was simply ignored. Adult women married to boys were expected to guide, manage, and sometimes wait. Wait for puberty, wait for sanity, wait for authority, and if things went wrong, if the boy grew into a weak king or an unstable one, the woman was blamed for not fixing him correctly, because of course she was. As we drift further into this topic, we'll meet more queens, more child kings, and more marriages that look calm in portraits and deeply unsettling in context. We'll see how these arrangements shaped wars, collapsed dynasties, and left behind generations of deeply anxious royals who never had a chance to be normal. But for now, just let that settle. A crown, a child, a woman expected to make it all work. Let's ease back in. Where we left off, we had a familiar image forming. A young boy crowned far too early. A woman placed beside him, expected to stabilize everything simply by existing in the correct garments. And a court full of men standing just far enough back to say, later on, that none of this was really their idea. So let's keep drifting. One thing that becomes clear very quickly when you study these marriages is that they were not designed for companionship. They were designed for time. Time to hold territory. Time to wait out a regency. Time to produce heirs before something went wrong. And something almost always went wrong. Let's float back to France again, because France never misses an opportunity to make things uncomfortable. In the early 16th century, we meet Claude of France. Claude was small, physically frail, and constantly underestimated. She married Francis I, who was only a year older than her, so this may seem like a break from our theme. But Claude's story matters because of what surrounded her. Claude herself had been betrothed as a child. Her body and inheritance discussed long before she could understand either. Her mother, Anne of Brittany, fought desperately to control her daughter's marriage, knowing that whoever married Claude would absorb Brittany into France permanently. This was not romance. This was a slow-motion annexation wrapped in wedding silk. Claude was married at 14. Francis was 15. Two teenagers, neither emotionally prepared, both crushed by expectations. Placed at the center of one of Europe's most aggressive monarchies, Claude spent her short life pregnant, almost constantly. She gave birth 7 times in 9 years. She died at 24. This is worth lingering on, because child marriages didn't just trap women emotionally. They used their bodies as infrastructure. Royal women were expected to produce heirs immediately, regardless of age, health, or exhaustion. And when the king was a boy, that expectation didn't pause. It simply shifted into an indefinite waiting room. Which brings us to Scotland. Scotland, like England, loved a child monarch, almost as much as it loved regretting that later, Mary, Queen of Scots, became queen at 6 days old. 6 days. She was crowned before she could see properly. And because Scotland was constantly worried about England, Mary's marriage became a matter of international anxiety. At 5, Mary was sent to France. She was raised there, educated, groomed, and eventually married to the Dauphin, Francis. Francis was about the same age, slightly sickly, and deeply sheltered. When they married in 1558, Mary was 15. Francis was 14. They became king and queen of France the following year, and then Francis died. He was 16. Mary, suddenly a teenage widow, returned to Scotland, a country she barely remembered, to rule alone. Her entire youth had been structured around a marriage that barely had time to exist. And when it was gone, she was expected to simply pivot into queenship, motherhood, and political leadership all at once. Mary's later marriages were disasters. Her life unraveled slowly and publicly. And while history often frames her story as dramatic and tragic, what's quieter is how little control she ever had. Her childhood was consumed by preparation for a role that vanished almost immediately. Now, let's glide east again, toward the Holy Roman Empire, where childhood marriages were practically a family tradition. The Habsburgs did not so much marry as they merged, and they started early. One of the clearest examples of adult women married to boy rulers comes from the reign of Ferdinand I and his descendants. But to understand that, we need to understand the Habsburg mindset. The Habsburgs believed in destiny, specifically their destiny, and they believed that destiny was best secured through early, strategic marriages that locked in claims before anyone could object. Girls were engaged in infancy. Boys were promised brides while still in tutors' arms. And when the wedding finally happened, often years later, the emotional distance was already baked in. One particularly stark example is Maria Anna of Spain. Maria Anna was married in 1631 to Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. Ferdinand was 23, so again, not a child. But Maria Anna herself had been raised from early childhood with one purpose: produce heirs, preserve bloodlines, do not ask questions. Their son, Leopold I, inherited this mindset entirely. Leopold I married his first wife, Margaret Theresa of Spain, when she was 15. He was 26. Margaret Theresa had been betrothed to him since childhood. She was also his niece. This is where dynastic weirdness quietly deepens. Margaret Theresa was emotionally immature, physically fragile, and trapped in a marriage where pregnancy was constant and dangerous. She gave birth multiple times. Most of the children died. She herself died at 21. Leopold remarried, and then again. But the pattern remained. Young women, enormous expectations, men who had been trained from boyhood to see marriage as obligation, not relationship. And when the husband was younger, when the king was a boy, the burden became even heavier for the woman involved. Let's slow down and look at one of the most extreme cases. In Portugal, King Sebastian ascended the throne at 3 years old. 3. He was raised with intense religious zeal, shielded from women, obsessed with crusading ideals, and deeply disconnected from reality. Sebastian never married. He never produced an heir. He died at 24 in a disastrous military campaign in Morocco. And because he had no children, Portugal fell into a succession crisis that eventually led to Spanish domination. Sebastian's failure to marry is often treated as a personal quirk, but it's also a result of a childhood spent being mythologized instead of humanized. He was not prepared for partnership, or intimacy, or governance. Now imagine if he had married. Imagine an adult woman placed beside him, expected to manage his religious obsessions, his emotional detachment, and his political recklessness. Because that is exactly what happened elsewhere. Let's return to France one more time and meet Anne of Kiev, and was married in 1051 to Henry I of France. Henry was already an adult, but Anne's importance comes later, as a regent. When Henry died, their son Philip I became king at 7 and ruled as regent. She signed documents, she negotiated, she governed, and then she remarried. This was scandalous, not because remarriage was immoral, but because a woman exercising personal choice threatened the illusion that queens existed only to serve dynastic needs, and was erased from much of French historical memory because she stepped outside the script. And this is important, because it shows us the narrow path these women were expected to walk. If they were too passive, they were useless. If they were too active, they were dangerous. And if they were married to a boy king, that line became even thinner. Let's gently shift our focus to Eastern Europe, where similar patterns played out with fewer surviving records, but just as much discomfort. In Poland and Hungary, queens were often older than their husbands, especially during periods of instability. A young king needed a wife who could anchor alliances and provide legitimacy. Age was secondary. Control was everything. One such case involved Jadwiga of Poland. Jadwiga was crowned King of Poland at 10 years old. Not Queen, King. Because the title mattered more than gender. She was married at 12 to Jogaila, Grand Duke of Lithuania, who was in his mid-30s. This flips our theme, but Jadwiga's life illustrates the same problem. Childhood erased by politics. She became a symbol rather than a person, a bridge between states, a walking treaty. She died at 20-5. Again. Notice how often these stories end early. Notice how often childhood is brief, adulthood is exhausted, and old age is never reached. Now, as we move forward in this series, we'll see how these patterns intensify, how child marriages create emotionally stunted rulers, how women married to boys become de facto regents, caretakers, and scapegoats, and how the quiet misery of these arrangements ripples outward into wars, rebellions, and dynastic collapse. But we're not rushing. No need, for now. Just sit with the image. A young king, crowned too soon, a woman beside him, waiting for him to grow up, a court watching closely, ready to blame her if he never does. Let's keep going, slowly. Let's settle back in. By now, a pattern has probably started to feel familiar, almost repetitive in a way that's oddly soothing. A crown lands on a child's head. The adults panic quietly. A marriage is arranged, and a woman, usually young but still older than the king, is expected to bridge the gap between childhood and sovereignty without ever acknowledging how strange that gap really is. This is where regencies come in. A regency was supposed to be a temporary solution, a polite pause, a holding pattern until the king was old enough to rule on his own. In theory, this was a calm administrative phase. In practice, it was a political knife fight conducted in slow motion. And when the king was married during or shortly after this phase, the queen often found herself functioning as a second regent, whether anyone officially admitted it or not. Let's drift to Austria in the 18th century. Maria Theresa is one of those historical figures people like to describe as powerful, competent, and formidable, and she was all of those things. But what often gets smoothed over is how young she was when responsibility swallowed her whole. Maria Theresa was married at 18 to Francis Stephen of Lorraine. That part seems ordinary enough. But her authority didn't come from being a wife. It came from inheritance. When her father died, Maria Theresa inherited the Habsburg lands, despite widespread opposition. Her husband, though technically Holy Roman Emperor later on, was largely sidelined. Maria Theresa ruled. She governed. She reformed. She gave birth 16 times. But now let's look at the next generation. Her sons were married young. Her daughters were married younger. One of her daughters, Marie Antoinette, was sent to France at 14. Her husband, Louis XVI, was 15. He was awkward, withdrawn, and profoundly unprepared for both marriage and kingship. Their marriage went unconsummated for years. Marie Antoinette was blamed for this, of course. Whispers spread. Satirical pamphlets flourished. Her body, her morality, her competence were dissected endlessly, while her husband quietly struggled with anxiety, sexual dysfunction, and the crushing weight of expectation. Marie Antoinette was not married to a child king yet, but she was married to a boy who had never been allowed to grow up properly. And when he became king, that emotional immaturity did not magically resolve itself. She was expected to compensate. She did not succeed, and history was not forgiving. Let's float backward a bit now to a woman who did succeed, at least administratively. Catherine de Medici. Catherine married Henry II of France at 14. He was also 14. This starts evenly enough, but Henry never loved Catherine. He preferred his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who was old enough to be his mother. Catherine spent years sidelined, producing children while being ignored politically. But then Henry died suddenly, and Catherine's sons ascended the throne one after another. All of them young, all of them fragile, all of them deeply ill-prepared. Francis II became king at 15. He died at 16. Charles IX became king at 10. Henry III became king at 22. But emotionally he never quite left adolescence. Catherine became regent, and then queen mother, and then the central stabilizing force in a collapsing monarchy. She negotiated, she manipulated, she survived, and for this, history labeled her cold, scheming, and monstrous. But if you step back, what you see is a woman married young, ignored, then suddenly expected to hold together a kingdom because the men around her were either children or deeply unstable adults shaped by childhood power. This is one of the quiet truths of royal child marriages. They didn't just distort individual lives. They created dynasties where emotional development lagged far behind political authority. Let's drift over to Russia for a moment. Russia had its own traditions of early marriage, but with an added layer of isolation. Royal women were often kept in seclusion before marriage, uneducated, and unprepared for life outside the palace walls. Peter the Great tried to change this. He forced Western customs on his court, including marriage reforms. But even Peter married young. His second wife, Catherine I, began life as a peasant, was captured during war, and eventually became empress. She was older, emotionally resilient, and deeply pragmatic. When Peter died, Catherine ruled. This is significant. Catherine I was not born royal. She was not groomed for queenship, but she had lived. She had adapted. And when placed beside a powerful but volatile man, she learned how to manage him. Later, Russia would see Catherine the Great, married at 16 to Peter III, who was emotionally childish, obsessed with toys and Prussian drill, and entirely unsuited to rule. Catherine waited, she observed, and eventually she removed him. This is the most extreme version of the pattern we've been circling. A woman married young to a boyish ruler, expected to tolerate his immaturity indefinitely, until patience runs out or opportunity appears. Most women did not have Catherine's options. Most endured quietly. Let's return to England, because England offers some particularly clean examples of emotional mismatch. Edward VI became king at 9. He was highly educated, deeply Protestant, and physically frail. He did not marry. He died at 15. His sister, Mary I, ascended the throne as an adult and married Philip II of Spain, who was younger than her by 11 years. This reverses our theme, but again highlights the same discomfort. Mary was desperate for affection and legitimacy. Philip was distant, uninterested, and politically motivated. Their marriage was lonely. Mary suffered phantom pregnancies. She died without an heir. Elizabeth I watched all of this and chose never to marry. Elizabeth understood the risks. She saw what marriage did to women in power. She saw how age, gender, and expectation intersected to trap queens in impossible roles. She opted out. Which brings us to an important point. Not all royal women married to boys were victims in the same way. Some gained power. Some lost everything. Some survived by becoming emotionally distant. Others by becoming politically ruthless. But almost none of them had a choice. Let's slow down again. When a woman was married to a boy king, she was not just a wife. She was a placeholder for adulthood. She represented stability before it existed. She was expected to be patient, nurturing, loyal, fertile, and politically invisible, all at once. If the boy grew into a strong ruler, she was forgotten. If he grew into a weak one, she was blamed. And if he never grew up at all, she was trapped indefinitely. As we continue, we look at cases where these marriages became particularly strained, where the age gap widened into resentment, where the queen's role shifted from partner to caretaker to rival. We'll also see how these early marriages shaped parenting, producing the next generation of anxious, sheltered, emotionally underdeveloped royals. Because dynastic trauma, like dynastic ambition, tends to repeat itself. So stay with me. We're not done yet. Imagine a young boy king, sitting on a throne far too heavy for him. Beside him, a queen slightly older, expected to manage everything. She has to guide him, handle the court, produce heirs, and prevent the kingdom from collapsing. All of this while he is still learning how to be human, still learning what it means to make decisions, still learning how to walk among adults without breaking. Childhood is swallowed whole, adulthood is forced, and the queen, she becomes the steadying force. Spain shows the weight of this burden vividly with Juana of Castile. She married Philip of Burgundy, a man who was more of a political chess piece than a husband. Juana was young, emotional, deeply aware of the strings controlling her life, yet expected to perform perfectly. Philip, though older, focused more on alliances and inheritance than affection. Every decision, every move, every child they produced was dictated by dynastic need rather than desire. Her children were betrothed and married extremely young too, and adolescence barely existed for them. Now let's glide north to the Habsburgs, masters of dynastic discomfort. Girls were promised to boys while still toddlers. Their futures determined by charts and treaties rather than their wishes. Boys were assigned brides they would meet only years later, often strangers by the time of the wedding. Margaret Theresa of Spain married her uncle, Leopold I. At 15, he was 26. She was frail, emotional, and trapped in an endless cycle of childbearing and political expectation. Most of her children did not survive. She herself died at 21, worn down by duty and circumstance. Let's float to France. Catherine de' Medici married Henry II. At 14, Henry preferred his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a woman older, clever, politically savvy. Catherine spent years producing heirs while being largely ignored and undervalued. Then Henry died, and her sons became kings one after another. Francis II at 15, Charles IX at 10, Henry III at 22, but emotionally adolescent. Catherine became regent, queen mother, and the central stabilizing force in France. She negotiated, she schemed, she survived. Yet history painted her as cold, manipulative, and monstrous. Because that's the pattern, young boy king, queen expected to stabilize, compensate, and endure. Fail, she's blamed, always blamed. Moving eastward, Russia gives us another extreme example. Peter III, the husband of Catherine the Great, was childish, obsessed with toys and drills. Entirely unsuited to rule, Catherine married at 16, observed, learned, and waited. Eventually, she removed him and ruled. Her power came not just from marriage, but from surviving and adapting to his immaturity. Most women married to boyish or immature rulers did not have that option. They endured quietly. Portugal provides a glimpse of the risks. King Sebastian became king at 3 years old, raised with religious zeal and isolation. He never married, never produced heirs, and died in a disastrous campaign at 24. Leaving a succession crisis, the pattern repeats across Europe. Child kings, adult women forced to anchor them, courts watching closely, ready to blame her if he fails. The emotional labor, the pressure, the isolation, it is immense and relentless. Even when the boy king grows older, it rarely ends. The woman remains the steadying hand, the political operator, the caretaker of fragile monarchs and unstable dynasties. History often forgets this, remembering only kings or wars, never the quiet endurance of these queens. In Poland and Hungary, young kings often had queens older than themselves. The reason was simple. Legitimacy and alliances mattered more than affection. A young king needed someone to anchor him, to guide him through politics he barely understood. Jadwiga of Poland is a striking example. She was crowned king of Poland at 10, not queen because the title mattered more than gender. At 12, she married Jogaila, Grand Duke of Lithuania, who was in his mid-30s. Childhood disappeared entirely. She became a living symbol of a political alliance. Her personal desires were irrelevant. Her role was to unite nations and secure succession. She died at 25, leaving behind a legacy of diplomacy and quiet endurance. Now let's move to England, where dynastic pressure often created painfully awkward marriages. Edward VI became king at 9, frail, deeply Protestant, and completely unprepared for rule. He did not marry and died at 15, leaving the kingdom in the hands of others. His sister, Mary I, married Philip II of Spain, who was 11 years younger than her. This reversed the usual pattern, but the dynamics were the same. Mary needed affection and legitimacy. Philip was distant, politically motivated, and mostly uninterested. The marriage was lonely. Mary suffered phantom pregnancies. She died without an heir, leaving the throne to her sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth observed carefully. She never married, understanding the danger and emotional toll of these royal unions. Meanwhile, in Russia, Catherine the Great exemplifies both extremes. She married Peter III at 16, a boyish, immature ruler obsessed with military drills and Prussian ideals. She was smarter, stronger, and emotionally prepared, while he was entirely unprepared to govern or partner. Catherine waited, observed, and adapted. Eventually, she removed him and became one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. But very few queens had her luck, intelligence, and decisiveness. Portugal, again, reminds us how fragile childhood kingships could be. King Sebastian ascended at 3. He was raised in isolation, steeped in religious zeal. He never married, never had heirs, and died at 24 in Morocco, creating a succession crisis. Spain, Austria, and France all show the same recurring pattern. Young kings, women married to them slightly older, forced to anchor their reigns. Political stability depended on these women. Yet their stories are often forgotten. Even when the boy king grows, his immaturity can persist. The queen remains caretaker, regent, mediator, and sometimes scapegoat. Dynastic trauma, emotional labor, and political expectation rarely end with childhood. And then there are the cases where marriages were so young, so mismatched. They bordered on tragedy. Girls of 12 or 13 married teenage or young adult kings, expected to produce heirs, maintain alliances, and survive emotionally impossible conditions. The queen often becomes the de facto regent before she even understands what marriage is. She handles rebellion, diplomacy, childbirth, and palace intrigue simultaneously, and if the king grows weak, unstable, or ill, she is blamed for his failures. History rarely records the endurance, the quiet suffering, the patient navigation of danger. Instead, it remembers the kings, the wars, the headlines. The women married to boys are almost invisible, except for whispers of scandal or rumor. These marriages were a mix of politics, survival, and forced maturity. The boys often never learned adulthood properly. The queens had to fill the gap, often at immense personal cost. France again shows us the strain of child kings and their adult queens. Louis XIII became king at 9, after Henry IV's assassination. His mother, Marie de' Medici, acted as regent, effectively running France for several years. When Louis XIII married Anne of Austria at 14, he was already 16 and was thrust into a court full of intrigue, suspicion, and power struggles she barely understood. She had to adapt immediately, navigating politics while adjusting to a husband still growing into adulthood. The couple's marriage was famously distant. Louis XIII was emotionally reserved, absorbed in hunting, war, and religion. Anne of Austria had to find her place, balancing influence, survival, and motherhood. Now let's drift eastward to the Habsburgs. Ferdinand II married Maria Anna of Bavaria when she was 14. He was 21. She was expected to produce heirs and stabilize an empire embroiled in religious wars. Later, their children continued the pattern. Infant betrothals, teenage marriages, dynastic pressure shaping emotional development from the cradle. Women married to boys had to manage households, alliances, and heirs while still growing themselves. The Tudors provide particularly striking examples. Edward VI's father, Henry VIII, famously had his children married young or engaged early. Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter, married Louis XII of France at 18, a man much older and politically demanding. Her marriage was intended to secure an alliance, not affection. Mary struggled with health, emotional isolation, and her role as a political instrument. She was widowed within months, returning to England. Her youth marked by political necessity rather than choice. Elizabeth I, observing her sister's fate, refused marriage altogether. She understood the dangers of marrying a boy king or politically immature husband. Her careful decision highlights how perilous these unions could be. Moving back to Spain, Maria Anna of Austria married Philip III at 16. Philip was emotionally dependent, unambitious, and largely uninterested in governance. Maria Anna became a political force by default, managing court affairs and influence quietly but decisively. Portugal, again, had child kings with queens forced to anchor their reigns. Young rulers required stability, and adult women were expected to provide it without recognition. Their lives were dictated by dynastic urgency, not by personal desire or agency. Even minor royal courts followed the same pattern. Scandinavia, the German states, and Italy all arranged marriages, where girls were older than their young husbands or vice versa. Expectations, political alliances, and succession often outweighed maturity, love, or happiness. The recurring pattern is clear. Young boy king, adult or teenage queen. The court observes. Power shifts. Political crises loom. The queen stabilizes everything, silently enduring the pressures of dynastic duty. And when the boy matures, it rarely solves the problem. His immaturity may persist, creating long-term reliance on his queen's political, emotional, and practical guidance. Dynasties function, history moves forward, and the queen's labor is almost invisible. In these marriages, childhood ends abruptly. Adolescence is consumed by duty. Emotional growth is secondary to political necessity. Queens become caretakers of fragile rulers and empires, their own lives sacrificed to stabilize others. The stories repeat across centuries, borders, and cultures. Adult women married to boys navigate a delicate balance of authority, influence, survival, and endurance. Yet history often remembers only the kings, wars, and succession crises. France again, with one of the most famous examples, Charles VI and Isabeau of Bavaria. Charles became king at just 11. He was a child, deeply fragile, and unprepared for rule. Isabeau married him at 14, entering a court brimming with intrigue and expectation. Charles soon began to suffer severe mental illness. He would forget people, attack servants, or believe he was made of glass. Isabeau had to navigate this instability while producing heirs and maintaining her position. She essentially became the kingdom's stabilizer. Yet history blamed her for extravagance, immorality, and political failings. The man was fragile. The woman bore the blame. Now, fast forward to the 18th century with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Marie arrived in France at 14, married to Louis, a boy king of 15. He was awkward, reserved, and emotionally inexperienced. Their marriage went unconsummated for years, causing rumors and court whispers. Marie was expected to perform her duties despite her youth and inexperience. She became a target of gossip and political criticism almost immediately. Louis XVI struggled to grow into kingship. He avoided conflict, politics, and confrontation whenever possible. Marie Antoinette had to compensate, managing appearances, alliances, and the court's endless intrigue. England offers similar quiet tragedies. Henry VI, child king of England, married Margaret of Anjou at 15. Margaret was older, forceful, and politically adept, becoming the de facto ruler during Henry's mental breakdowns. She led armies, negotiated peace, and defended her son's claim to the throne. Yet history often portrays her as manipulative or excessively ambitious. A young boy king could not rule effectively, and the woman married to him absorbed all responsibility. In Spain, Maria Luisa of Savoy married Philip V, a boyish king obsessed with personal interests. She navigated a court full of political factions while ensuring succession and stability. Her influence was immense, yet quietly overshadowed in history books across Europe. The same pattern repeats. Young boy king, adult or teenage queen, expected to stabilize, manage, and survive. Childhood ends abruptly, adolescence consumed by duty, and personal desires ignored. Even when the boy grows older, emotional maturity often lags behind authority. The queen remains the anchor, protector, and mediator. Dynasties survive, wars are fought, but her labor remains invisible. These marriages were political, emotional, and often physically taxing. Queens navigated childbirth, diplomacy, and fragile rulers simultaneously, and if the king failed or the dynasty faltered, she was blamed first. In sum, history is full of women married to boys, quietly carrying the weight of empires. Their lives shaped political outcomes, stabilized unstable monarchs, and endured emotional strain few could imagine. Yet their stories are whispers beside the loud drama of kings, wars, and succession crises. Let's move back to France one final time and consider the long-term impact of these child marriages. Kings like Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and their early marriages shaped not just personal lives, but entire dynasties. Women married to boys had to navigate power vacuums, political intrigue, and fragile heirs. Marie Antoinette, again, exemplifies the emotional cost. She arrived as a teenager, married to a boy king still growing into himself. Her youth was sacrificed to tradition, political expectation, and the pressures of Versailles. She produced children, maintained appearances, and tried to influence governance. Yet whispers, pamphlets, and public scrutiny constantly undermined her efforts. She became a symbol of excess and blame, while Louis XVI's immaturity went largely unexamined. In England, Margaret of Anjou shows the same dynamic. Married to the young Henry VI, she became the de facto ruler during his periods of mental breakdown. She led armies and negotiated peace, all while her husband drifted in and out of awareness. History often judges the queen harshly, overlooking the boy king's emotional immaturity. Her efforts to stabilize the kingdom are minimized or ignored. Dynastic survival rested on her endurance, intelligence, and patience. In Russia, Catherine the Great illustrates both extremes. Married at 16 to the immature Peter III, she observed, adapted, and eventually assumed power. Her success was rare. Most queens endured quietly, with little recognition. Portugal's King Sebastian and Spain's Maria Luisa of Savoy show the fragility of child rulers. Young kings could die, fail, or remain incapable, leaving queens to fill impossible roles. Dynasties depended on these. Women more than anyone else, yet history often forgets them. Even minor courts across Scandinavia, Germany, and Italy followed the same pattern. Girls older than their boyish husbands expected to produce heirs, stabilize rule, and navigate court politics. Childhood and adolescence were erased for both parties in these arrangements. The emotional labor was immense. Queens acted as caretakers, regents, diplomats, and mothers simultaneously. Every failure, every misstep was blamed on them. While the young king's immaturity was largely excused, what emerges is a quiet, persistent truth. Across Europe, generations of women were married to boys not for love, but for dynastic necessity. They endured, adapted, and shaped history from behind the throne. These marriages produced heirs, stabilized kingdoms, and occasionally prevented wars. But they also created emotional strain, dynastic trauma, and lifelong responsibility for women who were barely adults themselves. History remembers kings, wars, and succession. It rarely remembers the silent endurance, intelligence, and influence of these queens. Yet without them, much of Europe's royal history might have collapsed entirely. So, as we reflect on these stories tonight, think of the quiet power behind the throne. The women married to boys, the silent anchors of kingdoms. Their lives were marked by duty, endurance, and the invisible weight of shaping history. And with that, we can let our minds drift. The crowns, the young kings, the queens who carried them, they all remain, quietly, in history's shadows. A reminder that sometimes the most important rulers were not those with the throne, but those who supported it.
Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather, hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People slept at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warm and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal. Animal were afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe Cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones, they rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities were born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factories started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This, thank you. Today, now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling mm, very relaxed now, because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you. Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools, and no books. This is the story of Fire. Fire is not just a thing, but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire, there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather, hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People slept at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warm and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal. Animal were afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones, they rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities were born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factories started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This, thank you today. Now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling mm, very relaxed now, because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you. Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools, and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing, but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire, there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather, hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People slept at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warm and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal. Animal were afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools, the iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones, they rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans to spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities were born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factories started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This, thank you today. Now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling very relaxed now, because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you.